Welcome everyone to the webinar. It's lovely to see so many of you in the attendees box. And great to be here with Briar, my co-host, and Mark and Marijam for this excellent conversation on games and anti-fascism. As I mentioned, my name is Max Haiven, and I am here representing two groups that are putting on this event. One of them is the Games Transformed Festival, which is an annual festival in London dedicated to radical games and radical play, and also the struggle of game workers and games for a better world. And the other is Rival, the ReImagining Value Action Lab, which I direct at Lakehead University in the auspices of my job there as the Canada Research Chair in the Radical Imagination. If you have any questions or concerns, you can reach out via the Q&A function here in the webinar, and we will try and make sure to get to them, but I'm presuming everyone can hear us and see us. And yes, as I mentioned a moment ago, this event is going to be recorded and with some light editing put up on the YouTube channel of Games Transformed and the podcast of Rival. But that just means for those of you who are attendees that we will not mention your name if we relay your question to our guests, but you may be advised to limit the amount of identifying features that you choose to reveal in that case. And just before I hand it over to Briar to introduce our guests today and start leading off with some questions, I just want to mention that this event is in service of the 2026 Game Jam that is being organized by Games Transformed. It is a continuation of last year's festival theme, Smash the Fash. So it's about anti-fascism in games. And if you are interested, you can go to the Games Transformed itch.io page and sign up to be part of the Game Jam. For those of you who don't know what a Game Jam is, it's when you harvest ripe and juicy games and squash them into a kind of sweet preserve that you smear on bread. No, it's not. It's in fact, it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity to build games, experimental games, prototype games, in response to a call. So this year we've asked people to make games and somehow help us think through the problem of fascism and how to destroy it. Those could be any kind of games. And I really want to stress this both for the Game Jam and for our conversation today. We are, of course, interested in video games of all sorts, for consoles, for phones, for little tiny devices, for like hacked Tamagotchis, whatever you want to do. But we are also interested in live action role-playing games, tabletop role-playing games, strange augmented and alternate reality games, games that you play with your cat, games that you play with birds in your neighborhood. Whatever you think about as a game, we are interested in hearing from you, especially if that game is anti-fascist. And you can submit it via the itch.io page. And the lucky winner will have their game installed in some way in a special custom-built arcade game cabinet in the clubhouse of the fabulous Clapton Community Football Club in London, which has a storied anti-fascist history and a wonderful clubhouse that you can visit if you are ever in that city. So I think with all that in mind, I'm going to pass it over to Briar to introduce our guests and start leading off with some of the questions.
Yes, I'll briefly introduce myself first. I'm Briar Dickey. I'm a PhD researcher at the Vrije Universiteit Brussels, and I have been working on fascism games and platformed play, so the platformed play of far-right influencers, which has led me now to focus more on the anti-fascist possibilities of digital games. And because of that, I'm quite influenced by both of our guests today, the first of which is Mark Bray, who is a historian of modern Europe at Rutgers University, focusing on themes of radicalism, political violence, and more recently, scams. He's also the author of Antifa, the Anti-Fascist Handbook, and the Anarchist Inquisition, Assassins, Activists, and Martyrs in Spain and France, amongst other works. And our second guest, Marijam, who is a Lithuanian Tatar games industry critic, dissecting the intersection between video games and IRL politics. Her work has been published by The Guardian, by Vice, by GamesIndustry.biz, by the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung, and others. Marijam was a lecturer at Royal Holloway, the University of London, and is currently a senior marketing executive at a BAFTA-winning video game studio. In the past, Marijam has served as the chair of communications committee for Game Workers Unite International, which is an organization that assisted the global push for unionization in the video games industry. She also co-founded GW UK, the first legal trade union that has come out of the movement. And finally, she's an author of Everything to Play For: How Video Games Are Changing the World, which is a book that is extremely relevant to this conversation. And actually, Max, I'm going to pass it over to you for a moment to ask your signature question.
Thank you. Marijam, thanks so much for joining us. I always like to begin with this question, which is if you can think of a game that changed the way you saw the world. Maybe it was a game that you played as a young person that changed the way you saw the world. Maybe it was a game you played last week. Maybe it was a video game. Maybe it was an analog game. But can you think of a time when playing a game of some sort really changed the way that you just saw the world?
Oh, thank you so much. That is, I guess, a loaded question that always comes back to that question of efficacy that is of real interest of mine, and I dedicate an entire chapter to that in the book. And I do wonder, I'm sorry to be bringing out already the kind of positioning of limitations, but the limitations of potential kind of the changing of one's mind. I was definitely informed, and I can think of, Bioshock informed me of Art Deco architecture, or Mafia informed me of the jazz, American jazz, or of course like Conflict Desert Storm about American imperialism. So, or I feel like when I encounter a piece of art that will occasionally bring that gorgeous feeling of subliminal, right? Something that is this affect of realizing that you've seen something extremely special. I think I think of her story certainly was one of those click moments for me. I think when I just understood how games can be entirely different. But I'm also saying just the pure sense of, I guess, just joy and complete just understanding that I can fly in the world. I will always have to go back to Quake Arena. It's just something about feeling completely in control of a particular environment, and feeling terribly empowered by that. Strafing around a level that always felt, I'm quite a short person, and just to feel like I can be somehow, like embodying as a big being in this entire level was always very still to this day is huge for me. So sorry for a slightly complicated answer, but I'm always kind of I'm curious to complicate some of the concepts as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you. And Mark, what about you?
Yeah, I guess for me, games that feel like they are a very slow build with a lot of delayed gratification and a lot of work towards something that you build up towards later. And especially when you're playing when you're younger, you don't even necessarily get there. Like, I liked Monopoly as a kid, but halfway through it would always end. But I would be, oh no, but like once I have all of these properties, I'm going to be in good shape. Or some of the Civilization games. And as a historian, I always really liked those when I was younger. And as far as how it changed my view on the world, like thinking through in those games the relationship between a surplus of agriculture and specialized forms of artisanal production and so forth, like that made those connections for me when I was younger. But I think it's also interesting that, and this will probably come up more later on, is that I played games a lot when I was younger, and then becoming a teenager, a young adult, I kind of put them at arm's length for a while as I pursued other things, because I felt like they were potentially this time suck that would like like rob me of my time for other things, and I've come back to them in a way that works for me as a healthy way as an adult. But I think it's also interesting that the kind of perspectives that people who are interested in leftist politics see as potentially as a conflict, and what's so great about this is not seeing them that way.
Also, shout outs to Pokemon Go. I feel like that made us all reimagine what a city can be as well. So that's another extra one. But I'm really interested to discuss also with Mark about the left's perception as well of gaming and the failures of that and so on.
Super interesting. Maybe to give a little bit of a basis to the political topic of this webinar, I can ask you, Mark, maybe based on your work, to give us a little bit of a basis to understand anti-fascism, first of all, because this is the question that we're addressing here. In your understanding, how can we understand what anti-fascism is? And perhaps you can also reflect a little bit, because this has been the subject of a book that you've written. What are the different strands and modalities of anti-fascism?
Sure. Well, I mean, I guess just to say a few words on fascism without making this a whole fascism lecture. I think, particularly if we think about fascism in terms of games, I think it's helpful to think of perspectives on history and identity, and questions around what is quote unquote natural and normal in society. Because a lot of what fascism has been historically, is now, is this argument that things have been distorted, that natural quote unquote hierarchies have been thrown out of whack, and that the only way to put things back right is through this kind of mass populist righteous violence against the enemies of the nation or the race or whatever kind of in-group is in question. And so in that sense, of course, it takes different flavors, looks a little different in different times and places, but I think that that's central to it, and I think that's part of what can kind of be dangerous about certain forms of fascist interpretations of games, is enacting that kind of violence against difference in different forms of gaming. As far as anti-fascism, right, there have been different threads and strands and tendencies within anti-fascist history, even including conservative and liberal strands, which are very centrist and aim to just sort of return to the status quo. There have, of course, been more radical militant forms of anti-fascism, which argue for not having faith in the state or the police to stop the fascist threat, and not only aim to stop fascism, but aim to promote the creation of a more egalitarian post-capitalist future after stopping fascism. And so that's the kind of politics that I've focused on in my research, and to me is the more generative way of thinking for discussing these games, is not just staving off the worst possible thing that can happen, but trying to change the way we interact with each other through play.
So maybe then it's interesting to connect this a little bit to your work, Marijam, because I think this vision of sort of a post-capitalist society that you talk about, Mark, that is quite central to certain more militant forms of anti-fascism, speaks a little bit to some of the discussions in your book, Marijam, which you take quite a materialist perspective in your understanding of both the possibilities and the limitations of games as a way of doing radical politics. And I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit in terms of how does the conventional game industry as it is now perhaps undermine some of these generative possibilities that we might otherwise see as possible in games and game making?
Thank you so much. Yeah, certainly. I go in the book through kind of 50 years of weaving of history of that sort of intersection between, I suppose, games and politics, that and certainly of fascist tendencies within them that stem from as major as kind of governmental interventions. So hundreds of millions in that are injected in the video games industry in the early 2000s by United States Department of Defense, and the kind of the eventual, I think very quick and very quick understanding by right-wing influencers that this is a space where many people can be empowered. I would go as far as to say that if it wasn't for the 2014 Gamergate that's organized by Steve Bannon, we wouldn't have even had Trump and so on. So of course, so all of this percolates, and we can talk about many of the reasons why the left hasn't been there in this space. I mean, it's because the games industry is more of a sibling of Silicon Valley, rather than kind of a organic or a cultural kind of space that we would like to, I guess, justify it as being. But but I suppose I worry that it's early days in terms of us mounting a response. So I can see that the sun is sort of creating very dramatic shadows over here. But yeah, so and so it's early days. But I think what would be really limiting is for us to answer on a purely aesthetical or narrative driven or kind of subcultural way, if I were to say so. So this is where I bring in what I believe is to be that sort of like materialist approach, which would encourage for anti-fascist game making to be looking at itself, not necessarily or even not at all potentially from the perspective of a story that is being told, or even the mechanics that are being utilized that much, because there's very limited, I think, research into the actual efficacy of it, because we're sort of slightly doing the kind of Schrodinger's cat in regards to, we're saying, no, violent video games, they don't really, make people violent, but on the other hand, we're saying that they could do. So I do sometimes think that game designers want to really take on that responsibility on themselves as to changing people's minds. But what I would encourage, and we'll go into all of these details, and I kind of have like a bit of a taxonomy of like advice, I suppose, into different methods, but certainly be looking into how games are made, right? And into the mode of production of it all. I can kind of imagine that if Apple, Apple Store or Steam was filled with, let's say, just left-wing games, but left-wing looking or sounding story games, but it would be fundamentally, we would live in the same world, Whereas I think if we just wouldn't have those kind of conglomerates, and if we would be making games under just much more all to do with hardware, and of course under much more horizontal perspective kind of methods of making, then I don't even think it would matter even what is in the actual kind of portraiture of the game itself. It would just be an entirely different world. So I guess I kind of this is my sort of message that I sometimes want to bring to the players, that we mustn't just close ourselves into the sort of like a creation, like reproduction of social capital, which to me also social capital is another thing to say about how that creates fascism, right? And be stuck in our own milieus in that way. Sorry about that.
It was super interesting, more at this like structural level and this narrative level. I want to go back to anti-fascism, or this is anti-fascism, but I want to go back to this sort of like perspective on anti-fascism and the trajectory of anti-fascism, and ask you, Mark, what you feel are the particular contemporary challenges of the anti-fascist movement that might be distinctive to the historical perspective that you've given in your book previously.
Yeah, well, fascism from the start has taken advantage of new forms of communications technology to promote its message. Radio, TV back in the day, the internet for decades, social media, and video content recently. I think back to the context in the United States over the past 10 years or so, and how during the era of the Unite the Right, the far right really tried to establish their own independent street presence with Unite the Right and with subsequent demonstrations, particularly in the Pacific Northwest. And they kind of gave up on that for the most part in the US after around 2019, apart from a few flash mobs here or there, right? But part of that is because the anti-fascist movement did a good job of confronting them in the streets, but also because I think it matters less than it used to. It still matters, but it matters less because of the huge impact that social media and YouTube and different platforms and games among them have in influencing how people think, how they think of the community, how they associate with each other. And so responding to that from an anti-fascist way, from an anti-fascist perspective, creating our own alternative content, trying to sabotage in one way or another the messages that they're trying to promote, is not an entirely new challenge, but the context and the platforms have changed a lot, and the cultural aura around it has changed. I think that's a big part of it. I mean, then there's also, of course, the criminalization of anti-fascism in a number of different countries in the US and Europe. again, not entirely new, but it has its particularities of what's going on now, and associating it with terrorism. So those are a few things that come to mind. But I think it's also important to connect, like when we talk about games and fascism, where's games and fascism and games and like imperialism and games and racism, right? That there's Venn diagrams here. And so that's always been true with fascism and anti-fascism as being connected to other kinds of politics. It's true today as well, and connects to a number of other different struggles.
So I think both of you in different ways speak to a little bit of a critical political economy of media to a certain extent. I'm interested then, because I feel like, Marijam, you have spoken quite a lot about the limitations at this political economic or the structural level in relation to the gaming industry, bearing in mind some of these challenges that there are for contemporary anti-fascism and also these industry level sort of limitations that you describe. What is the radical potential of games in this struggle? Can you maybe give us some hope?
No, absolutely. And when I say limitations, I mean limitations. Okay, twofold. One, I suppose, is as I worry sometimes that, for instance, I hear these trends of like green games or anti-colonialist games, and like surely these people must be aware the amount of harm that video games industry does, not only in regards to CO2 emissions, but also the structural horrific genocidal harm that is doing in Democratic Republic of Congo or Indonesia in regards to the hardware that is needed for our games to exist, right? So it's always just like maybe it would have been more efficient to, I don't know, like print 1,000 books one indie game. I don't know, like it's just those questions that I think is very important to kind of unpick, because we live in a society and we live in an industry that works in a particular way that is fundamentally very fascist, colonialist, and extremely of course, brown in terms of its emitting of all of the sewage of the actual, ecologically and so on. So this is the sort of the hypocrisy that we need to live with and actually talk about very actively and trying to get out of. So yes, that's one thing. And then I suppose, I sometimes, as I say, kind of I want for people to interrogate whether they're making a particular game in order to be liked by their peers or to actually change somebody's minds, because those, I think, can sometimes be quite different things. But I definitely go through a bunch of ways that I guess this is the spot where I think that we can be that games are special or can actually do things that other mediums cannot, and so I think it would be very, very interesting for us to think of ways of perhaps putting a hook in the game that would perhaps unspool itself a bit more unexpectedly. So that is in regards to its own narrative or mechanic, so perhaps meeting the player where they are, rather or the player of whose mind you're thinking of changing, and then perhaps planting some sort of a way to create that kind of the moment of changing of their minds. I think modes of distribution are way more interesting. Again, something with games is, there's a lot of steps in finding the game, downloading it, paying the money to download it, install it. It's very hard to encounter. I think of street art, which I think has much more possibility to just be encountered whether you want it to or not. With games, there's a certain intentionality, right, in order to even play it. So you have to sort of think of modes of distribution as to how somebody finds the game. I think of some, the Uber game is the one that I always bring up, just because it's like it was released, it's a lefty game, but released by the Financial Times, right? So a center-right publication. So that to me is more interesting than if it was released via The Guardian or whatever, right? I think community action, that's something that we haven't spoken about at all, but community to me is where it's at, a lot of the time, right? Because something that is so special with games is that we have these extremely potent, active, obviously sometimes toxic, but also very rich and incredibly thoughtful and creative and sophisticated political communities that can be activated in a variety of ways. And it doesn't necessarily have to. So I think sometimes, again, with anti-fascist games, we're thinking of an author and then we're thinking about the players, right? But and it's a very kind of vertical relationship. And I wonder what would be the way to actually create more of a sandbox where that kind of horizontality appears. And in fact, the kind of maybe the aesthetic is not even attached to it, but the way that the community interacts with the game is a place for potentially much more radical interactions. You know, again, like Minecraft, where so much politics happens, has no aesthetic essentially, right? It's Lego. So maybe again, stepping away from it a little bit, just thinking about games as tools rather than signifiers. And how to, good old Benjamin, who talks about how to, instead of making, well, he wouldn't say political games, I guess they would say political art, but instead of making political games, how we can make games politically. I think to me, is a more interesting approach in a way. And then, good old motor production, of course, is the studio structure, hardware, engines. The fact that we only have like 2 engines to work on our games it's ridiculous, right? Obviously, there's now a bit more diversity that is approaching as well. But and again, then I think games are at the forefront of the arts, of all arts, in fact, and some of the best artworks that I've seen lately. And I'm a person that goes to Venice Biennale every 2 years, is in games. And but we have to find ways that are again the sort of the hook or a way to approach a person who you want to touch is bringing a bit more sophistication also. So again, I just think, but it's community that currently right now is actually something that's very interesting to play with.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think that's a point that we often come back to at Games Transformed as well, that there's the game and then there's the contexts of play, in which people play that game, and thinking through games as a vehicle for community organizing. Sometimes even terrible games can be incredibly useful in that process. And sometimes the best political, like ideologically perfect games, nobody ever plays them for all sorts of reasons because they don't reach their community as well.
And like the class war happens in, sorry. No, just class war happens in EVE Online, or it doesn't happen necessarily in like, again, our lovely lefty political games, right? And again, in Ultima Online, that's where sort of, again, or Westward Journey, that's where we see anti-fascist demonstrations again. And you wouldn't even think of these games as lefty games, and these players wouldn't see themselves as lefty players, but they are doing those acts. And another thing with gaming that makes it so special is that it really fosters, and I think we should be thinking how to foster and encourage anonymous or pseudonymous involvement. Again, I keep thinking about like the final frontier actually of anti-fascism to me is the sort of the idea of how of the hierarchies that are created by social capital and all of that. And I think in gaming, how many people are creating entire mods and entire games, and we will never find out who they are? With artists, with filmmakers, with musicians, you'll always find out who they are. There's so much competition in that. And with gamers, there's this beautiful anonymity that takes place, and that can be dangerous at times. But I think I want to encourage that as a space for potential, again, encouragement of really kind of radical and anti-materialist way of approaching somebody's labor and art.
Yeah, that's great. We're going to circle back to that in a second, but I think, probably some of our visitors here, some of the attendees of this webinar and people who watched afterwards are game makers. And I think they might be wondering, well, like, is there a game out there that we would associate with fascism, with a fascist perspective? And how are games used by fascists to spread their ideology? And I guess I'd like to ask both of you this question, maybe starting with Mark. Are there particular games out there that you've seen that you think echo or reiterate or propagate fascist ideas? And I'm going to ask you the same questions in a minute about anti-fascism, but we'll get to that in a sec.
Well, I mean, one part of this that is obviously pertinent but hasn't been the focus is sports, right? Some of the most popular games. So, I mean, my first thing that came to mind is like NASCAR. not that it necessarily does, but it is associated with. And that's an interesting question, right? The NFL, right? The flags, the military jets support the troops. You could hypothetically have American football without that, although then there's the question of all the stuff that it does to brain injuries and so forth. But I mean, or even going back to earlier on, I mentioned the civilization games. I think any kind of world conquest game is imperialist, if not fascist. And nevertheless, I'm someone who has enjoyed them, recognizing that there's a lot of problems with them, right? I think also there's the question of like what games are inherently fascist or not, versus the other question of what games do fascists happen to enjoy, and thinking through that as telling us something. And I'm sure some of you have in terms of video games could say more on that. And so like thinking about first-person shooters as another genre that I have enjoyed, that I do not think is necessarily inherently bad and could be an anti-fascist shooter. There are anti-fascist shooters. But then again, of course, the question around what kind of psychological state does it put someone in? You know, I haven't done research on these things, but these are important questions to ask. But I guess my first thought is essentially world conquest games. But with the asterisk that in some of these world conquest games, you can sort of conquer the world for some sort of better ideology, and then how does that change it? And there's not too many anarchist world conquest games, although there could be. The thing is, there could be. If someone makes it, I'll play it.
You've got the challenge, game makers. You've got the challenge, the anarchist world conquest game. Yes, yes. What I appreciated about your response is that I think in it you were making the points both that there are themes that are games that have fascist themes, but also there are mechanisms and genres of games that have these kind of fascistic, let's call it fascistic tendencies. Marijam, what do you make?
Thank you. Yeah. When you just started talking about sports, Mark, I was thinking as well. You know, Adorno would have a lot to say about that, because I think he wrote entire pieces how sports is essentially a fascism. But I to an extent agree with somebody who's not particularly athletic, but also I'm worried that it will become like the headline, right? Like left wing something, right? So it's not a political project just yet, and I do have something. I do think that competition, in terms of prowess in a kind of horizontal society that wouldn't perhaps be giving prizes or, again, social capital followers for people under those circumstances. It's actually, there is a beautiful project there. But yeah, definitely the daddy Theodore came to mind, and I think it is not an accident that a lot of the time. Right wingers understood that where they will gather is in fact in just less moderated video games. It will not necessarily again matter that much the content of the game, but they will look perhaps at the games where they know that they will be able to find an in. And when I think of the OG video games kind of organizer as somebody who was as early as, I thought it was 2010. I actually found out earlier this month that it was as early as 2006 Steve Bannon was already in World of Warcraft, right? And like World of Warcraft actually by itself is kind of a beautiful, kind of almost one could say cooperative game, with like a guilds forming entire into these incredible communities and building their own currencies, building their own like voting systems and so on. So sometimes really the where they organize and what the kind of the game itself is just doesn't compute. Same with Roblox, right? There isn't much there, and yet, oh my God, do fascists hang out in there, right? And I also think that it's very important that we finally are making the distinction that we are not, that I think the left wing's response cannot be we are not interested in violent games, right? Well, because we cannot allow the right to have a monopoly over violence. That would be very dangerous. And certainly we know that that the battle is big, and it will and might and already is in fact violent in a variety of places. And really, it's just about who wields the weapon a lot of the time, right? So again, I suppose what a fascist game maketh is usually the the cutting of corners in exec rooms where they just decide to underfund, the community management team that will perhaps keep the reins in there, and they will find a weak spot, and they will just multiply. So yeah, and most of the time, I don't know the extent to which that will really kind of compute to what we understand to be fascist or anti-fascist teams.
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to mention for some of our viewers who might not know your reference to Theodor Adorno, the Frankfurt School theorist. But I just wanted to interject that I had this game idea that I want someone else to steal from me, which would be a version of Secret Hitler, but it would be Secret Adorno. And it would basically be everyone around you is pretending to have a good time, but you're not having a good time, but you can't let anyone know that you're not having a good time. Um, anyway, Briar, over to you, I think.
Yes, so I'm going to flip this question on its head. I also want to ask a slightly secondary question. My first question, obviously, is what is an example of an anti-fascist game? What about it makes it anti-fascist? But I also want to ask, I was going to say to Mark, but maybe to both of you, what are things about anti-fascism as it is practiced in what you have researched or in your own context, or as you know, that is potentially playful or game-like? I think this is also an interesting question. So this is two questions. So
Yeah. Well, in terms of anti-fascist games, one of the first things that came to mind for me was the Anti-Fascist Olympics of 1936 that was held to oppose the official Olympics in Hitler's Nazi Germany. And so like that's a neat example of what Marijam, you were talking about in terms of like it's not always necessarily the game itself, but under what conditions is it played, what are the like values and economics that surround it, and so forth. And an example where leftists do not necessarily oppose competition. I think of like competition versus cooperative in gaming as a little bit about like the relationship between majority voting and consensus. That David Graeber once said to me that he believes majority voting can be consensus if everyone can consensus to go by what the majority goes with. And so the same thing with I think with competitive games, like if we all just recognize this is just for fun, and like maybe like at most like we'll stick a few humorous playful jabs at each other, but then it's whatever, then like it's essentially a cooperative game in a sense, right? Beyond that though, I think that there's also the question of kind of like, as I mentioned at the beginning, like identities and values, like even just challenging the vision that fascists have of what society should look like in terms of race and gender and sexuality and identity and clothing and behavior, and changing all that up. Like even some video games that I've played that don't strike me as particularly left or right have the opportunity for players to construct themselves how they want, fall in love with who they want, and even that creates to me a horizon of possibility that has an anti-fascist element to it, which of course doesn't obscure what Marijam was talking about, that like these games are still made by capitalists who are seeing a profit incentive in this and still destroy the environment and so forth and so on, but that there are openings for people who want to play games to envision values and identities and kinship relationships and societies differently. And that the other thing to just throw into the mix, because I kind of forgot to mention it earlier, but Marijam, you brought up in terms of community, is that there's the question of what do these games look like, but then there's sort of the notion of contesting a terrain. And anti-fascism historically has been all about contesting every terrain that fascists try to get a hook into, whether it's football fans or indie folk or whatever, and games are one of them in that as well. So, but I'll be quiet now and hear what Marijam has to say.
No, that's where you're evoking Papa Stuart Hall, of course, who most definitely, that was, I was lucky to study where he was lecturing at Goldsmiths, and of course, that's what was another click moment for me, right? Like that, for some reason, we are as the left, we're ignoring this biggest pop culture space there is, which is video games, bigger than music and film industries combined, right? But we are not seeing it as a contested space, right? And a place where people, the certain powers win or lose, and that we haven't even been playing there. I mean, even now we're playing with like with sticks and rocks when the right really has machine guns, right? Like they're paying right-wing influencers just to hang out in games, right? Like I mean, the idea of us just my day job just being hang out in some video games and just spread leftist propaganda, and get like 40K a year for that. Like that's not the world that we as the left live in, but that is the world that the right wing lives in. And so again, we're so behind, sadly. And so it's true that I kind of like I wouldn't want to also take away, like to me, like somebody creating an affect of joy is already anti-fascist, right? Like in the world of so much kind of misery and lack of communal opportunities, the idea that we're able to create some games where perhaps comrades can create a party or something, that already to me is a certain resistance to a current sort of privatization of everybody's time. So I'm not entirely dogmatic about it all. I understand that there should be a diversity of methods of resistance and so on, right? I guess I just sometimes I've seen it myself. I've been myself. I'm a punk to my heart. That we sometimes get stuck, to a certain kind of subcultural way to respond, and that's sort of the one thing that I want for us to avoid. And in which case, Pokemon Go, I do think is kind of an anti-fascist game, because it's sort of like in a very situationist way made me rethink, kind of the East London area. I think fighting games are actually anti-fascist in a variety of ways, because they're fighting games themselves can not necessarily be particularly of a giving a particular ideology, but fighting games community is historically urban working class that talks about kind of a lot of over-policing issues and actually protests against them very, very actively. When the arcades were closing down in the sort of the 70s and 80s due to over-policing actually in urban cities in America, it was the fighting games community that was at the forefront of opposing that. And to me, probably right now, like an anti-fascist game is probably one that kind of does somehow, resist the temptations of capital. And there is this, I write this vignette in the book. There was this guy with about 60 followers on Twitter that would like occasionally tag me on his basically on his console that he made out of recycled materials in his balcony, and that it is sun powered, and he made a tiny like twine Tetris on it, but it's essentially entirely green, and also with Raspberry Pis as well. So basically they're not actually kind of using any of the conflict minerals, and then I think that's where certain things get born. Of course, I don't want to say that we should be somehow looking at small is beautiful. I'm not about that at all. I think it's again worrisome if we just close ourselves into sort of small spaces. But yeah, sort of again looking at different ways how we will, now GTA 6 will come out, how we can have an anti-fascist response to that, right? How we can have it's something that we should also be thinking about. So working with already existing titles and thinking how can we create anti-fascist communities around them as well. So I guess it's sort of like it's not just about an anti-fascist game, but it's about all of us people who are essentially anti-fascist, inshallah, like finding ourselves to be, I guess, like finding our corner as how to create like a certain like a cell of resistance in a variety of ways of however way we can do it. And to some people, it will be like game designers who make the games, but to many of us, we'll have to find our way to filter the masses in a variety of creative ways. I don't know.
I just want to make a quick plug, though, for a specific game, which is Alex Knight designed a great Spanish Civil War board game called Land and Freedom Semi-Cooperative. It's great. Just want to put a plug out. Check it out.
Also, another plug, I guess, the Game Workers Conference is taking place this weekend. And that's also what I think, it's very important, I think, to connect that kind of workers struggle together with the anti-fascist struggle, because I don't know, like it was definitely very, very moving for me circa 2018, 2019, where I was getting a lot of messages from people who were like, I used to be in the alt-right, but then I started reading via gaming unionization movement about socialism, and now I changed my mind, like, what the hell? That's amazing, right? That relationship between the game player and the person who makes their favorite piece of art is so close. And I think when game makers say, like, look at material conditions, there is some sort of effect there. Well, definitely. So that worker struggle is another tool for us too, for sure.
Yeah, that's definitely an intersection that we are very dedicated to at Games Transformed, which we have a great presence from game makers, trade unions, and organizations there. And yeah, trying to put together workers' struggles with the struggles for new forms of meaning and community through games as well. So yes, huge plug for that.
And I saw,
I want
Max,
to
you're
now
involved now with
encourage
the.
those people.
No,
What's
no, no.
that?
I
Sorry.
just really wanted to congratulate that you're now working with Captain Community Football Club as well, right? Because football is something that's so universal, and again, doesn't have much more of like an anti-fascist flank, and so I'm really thankful that you're doing the work there.
Yeah, it's really, really rewarding. And I think I mean, my perspective, and I think something we've discussed in Games Transformed is that, we unfortunately in this part of the world at least, and the whole world via imperialism, inherits the legacies of the Protestant work ethic and the spirit of capitalism that says that play and fun is irrelevant, distasteful, and disreputable. And it's not real political work if we're talking about games and play, but actually games and play are what make life worth living for the vast majority of people. Alongside like love and relationships, and are also just a huge part of so many people's lives. So it feels really important to bring together different forms of play, whether they're sports, whether they're video games, tabletop games, but also, and this is also something just as an invitation for our audience as well. We're also in talks with people who are doing work in like queer and kink culture, thinking through different forms of play on that level as well. Like play is a huge part of our lives, and we don't want to limit ourselves just to that very particular sphere. But that's an invitation actually to the audience also to, if you have questions, you could drop them in the Q&A, and we already have one. But before we get to that, I want to kind of wrap up this first part of our session today with a kind of a broad question to you both, which is, I'm imagining in my fantasy that we have two kinds of folks here with us in this room and who are going to be watching this video. And some of them are game designers who want to integrate anti-fascism into their games and make games that contribute to an anti-fascist movement. And then type two are people who are involved in anti-fascist movements in a whole variety of different ways, who want to reach out to game makers and integrate games and play into their struggles. And I guess what advice or what pointers would you give each of those two groups, either the anti-fascists looking for gamers or gamers looking for anti-fascists? Mark, do you want to start?
Yep, sure. Well, I guess in a sense, right, that the two things are not completely mutually exclusive, but you're definitely right to like signal two poles there. And so to me, I mean, I like the idea of making anti-fascist games, but I also like the idea of just taking games that are just regular old games, but making the world of who plays them not monopolized by the far right, right? And that you can be whoever you are, enjoy whatever kind of game, but that doesn't mean you are one kind of person. Or it doesn't mean that the left is the enemy of fun, right? And that's like a big thing that the right tries to monopolize, is the notion that we have no sense of humor. We don't like to have fun. We like to ruin all their parties. And so I think part of what it could mean to make an anti-fascist game is to actually turn that on its head and show how really they're the ones who like literally want to murder fun. And how we are the side of possibility and exploration and challenging, what this world is really about. I mean, in terms of making an anti-fascist game, the easy way to make an anti-fascist game, quote unquote, is to do a game where you oppose the fascists. And I would enjoy a game like that. But I think probably more maybe profound would be games to me that challenge the premises that fascism are built on, that make us think differently about histories of nationalism, or again, I fall back on history because I'm a historian, but think differently about identity, think differently about collectivities, think differently about how we associate in our communities, what those communities mean, how to build, Kropotkin comes to mind, right? Like he aims to sabotage social Darwinism by looking at the history of mutual aid in the natural world among human beings and how that is a factor of evolution, right? So games that do that, I think, present that alternate way of looking at things. And so I guess just this is me spitballing as someone who is a leisure game player, but has not put nearly as much thought into it as Marijam, is that, if you have a way to bring people in with what looks like a typical game, and I think that masculinity is a big part of this conversation in a way that we've been talking around, but not necessarily talking at directly, is that a lot of the problem, correct me if I'm wrong, if anyone disagrees, is alienated young men. And if there's a game that looks like it's a game that appeals to them, but can undercut that, once they start playing it, I think that might be, a kind of a sweet spot. But that's what comes to mind for me.
Thank you. I would encourage for an anti-fascist game maker, I suppose, to pose a question to answer who is their game for, right? Because if it is for fellow anti-fascists to have a joyful moment, and that's super legit and awesome, and that's your answer, and that's probably you're gonna find ways to create an affect there. But if the mission would be to attempt to spread anti-fascism, which in my head means like I pick the game would then have to meet somebody who's not an anti-fascist and convert them, let's say, in very crude terms, then one has to think about, how to unravel the final, I guess, argument that they're attempting to make to somebody who doesn't agree with them at the point of entering the game. And that's so hard because I think a lot of the time, there's this, again, in the games academia sphere, there is this decades long argument about ludology versus narratology, right? And I think actually it's all down to marketing. It's actually how the game is marketed, right? Because a lot of the time it will be marketed, right, to a particular a group of people that will then reflect as to who will get to play it and experience it, and that also again limits the kind of contingency of people that will get to it. I think of like famous anti-fascist works of art. I think of a Guernica, or like a famous maybe 1950s or 40s, photography, or that was quite anti-fascist. And I think how it ended up being completely commodified, and who knows, the extent to which it's sort of to which it really, we call them anti-fascist pieces of art, but whether they actually had the effect of that, or whether they were more for peers is another, again, it can become another, it becomes another question. So yeah, so I definitely want to just provoke to think about, again, kind of who the audience is, and think of how to reach them. I think reaching them is so hard, right? And sometimes, as we discussed, there's maybe more via level of kind of community, or sort of fostering some sort of, again, anonymous engagement and so on. And as always, I would, of course, I think, games that are created in a sort of horizontal manner are likely to kind of foster a horizontal world to come. And then in terms of the anti-fascists themselves, I'm like amazed, and I have to pinch myself that we now live in the world where anti-fascists even care about this, because I feel like I've been so lonely. The amount of times, I was like hanging out in like London anarcho lefty spots and so on, and attempting to tell people that the gaming is important, especially to anti-fascist friends, and was just like laughed at and so on. It's so annoying. And so I'm finally like, oh my God, yes, we're being listened to. I mean, it took Trump's election twice for people to listen. But fine, okay, finally, hello, please join the resistance, I suppose. And number one, curiosity, not dismissal, actual interest in the industry and how it works, not, looking at the monopolization of the industry. I think that will also just kind of, that sadly creates a particular very, very narrow frame in how we can even express ourselves. And yeah, kind of meeting people, I suppose it was sadly, attempting to kind of meet people where they are, rather than kind of just necessarily closing ourselves off in our kind of clubs, although I do like them too. And I think just even the idea that anti-fascists can, like, after a strong, long day doing the anti-fascism on the streets, can go back and actually chill to a video game and without shame, that other lefties will shame them. That's already a win on my side. But yeah, just curiosity and not judgment, and understanding the kind of the systems within which we operate in this, very, very ever evolving space, I guess.
So we have a few questions from the audience, which speak to different interests, I think. The first one, maybe it's not a game that either of you played, maybe it's a game that both of you have played. Somebody's asking, what is your perspective on Helldivers 2? A question about a specific game. Does anybody have a particular perspective on this game?
Unfortunately, I haven't played it.
Okay. I can't say that I've played it either, but I mean, its structure slightly reminds me of games that I used to play, which is SWAT, as well as Conflict Desert Storm, which are the sort of, you're in a group of players, and you're, I guess, attempting raids and so on. And I mean, that's kind of my understanding. And again, unless I'm lacking of understanding of some sort of twist, that mostly those are games that under the right circumstance will perhaps inform me, but I don't know the extent to which they can convert me, but so that's the only thought I had.
Another question, talking about development structures. I love the idea of flat development structures, but I'm not even sure where to start in terms of development. I want to pay staff, so I would still be bound to investment capital. I find it hard to imagine building something else without first relying on a volunteer base to build things initially. Maybe this is something that you can speak to, Marijam.
Thank you. I mean, I also was sort of course, we hear of the kind of cooperative development studios here and there, and I used to think of them very much as an exception until I went to Argentina about 6 months ago for like the Spanish translation of the book, and that I was absolutely amazed. The games industry is well, I wouldn't say predominantly, but like there's like 20 or 30 co-op studios there, just very active and doing their work. It's actually the government, even under these horrific right-wing governmental structures right now, the government encourages cooperatives. Like historically, because of historical reasons, cooperatives are just really a very, very big part of Argentinian political economy. That's my understanding. And then there's like a entire incentive structures by the government to create cooperatives and to form themselves in cooperatives. So whenever like I hear game devs being curious about potentially structuring themselves in that, I would definitely recommend them to get in touch with Matajuegos, which is probably the biggest and most famous studio that has released quite a few successful releases, who actually have, I think, developed entire kind of advisory plans, and they give consultations to studios that are attempting to form themselves in that way. And of course, I don't want to sort of speculate about like sort of a work for exposure sort of things, but there are ways of thinking creatively, perhaps about not paying staff, because of course you have to pay staff, but there are again within cooperatives, then the share structure will be or the potential revenue structure will be given out in more horizontal ways. So it's not necessarily just that kind of the monthly budget. You can also agree on kind of revenue shares and things like that. But yeah, good on you for even caring about the stuff. I do think that's kind of it's very important to attempt to create kind of anti-capitalist ways of operating within this industry. But again, not just close ourselves in the margins.
We have a question that I want to propose that maybe all of us answer with one or two examples, which is, can we get a syllabus of games to play from this webinar? So I would propose that maybe all four of us answer from each of our subjective perspectives, is our favorite anti-fascist game or anti-fascist games. For me personally, I think something that I find perhaps that we haven't touched on so much in this conversation, we've touched a lot on sort of games that maybe speak to an audience that is being radicalized in a far right direction, and how to kind of touch those audiences. I think there's also value in making games for people who are already anti-fascist, just because it's fun. We deserve to have fun, and also because I think it's interesting for us to reimagine our own struggles and to imagine different worlds that we might want to live in just for our own political practice. I think that's also a very generative possibility in anti-fascist games, not only to make games to preach or to convince, but games to help us think through our own political practice and to have fun. Um, and so for me, I'm a big fan, more on the fun side than the generative political possibilities side. I'm a big fan of Tonight We Riot, the game by Pixel Pushers Union, which is a collectively workers-owned game development studio, which is a game about rioting and liberating factories. And this is not a game that I've played, but I want to maybe encourage people to wishlist it on Steam because I find it really exciting. Because Max and I had a conversation a while ago where Max asked me what my dream game would be to come out of this game jam. And I was really thinking that I really want a game about squatting. I really want a game about opening a building and about the interpersonal dynamics that come up when you're living in a squat and the decisions that you have to make within a squat and maintaining your building um, and defending it against the different both bureaucratic and physical threats that might come up against it. This would be my absolute dream anti-fascist game. And then somebody messaged me recently from the Reactionary Politics Research Network, actually. So maybe somebody who's in this audience told me about a game that is in development called Creatures Like Us, which is a game about squatting, about a queer squat. So maybe this is an interesting one for people to look into. Max, do you have a game or two games that you think people who are in this room should play?
Yeah, I mean, I'll give two that are maybe a bit obvious, but they're still worth mentioning. One of them is the game from Paint Bucket Studios, Through the Darkest of Times, where you play an anti-Nazi, basically terrorist cell in Germany in 1933. And what I like about this game is it's not it's fun in a way, but it's they've done a lot of research about what Germany felt like in 1933 and how many people supported the Nazis, but also how many people didn't. And it's a kind of fantasy about what it would be like to try and bring together an anti-fascist opposition that's messy in a lot of ways, and that does some messy stuff. So I think that's a really interesting game. And the other one that I would mention is Antifa le jeu, which is by our friends at La Horde, the French anti-fascist collective. It is a board game, sort of a society game where you get together and you have to face down fascist organizers and pool your community's resources and respond to crises. I I can't say this is a game I really enjoy playing because it is actually really realistic to what it feels like to do anti-fascist organizing. Um, so, I'm here for the trauma bonding. Yeah, that's what I'd say.
Maybe I could pass on to Mark. Do you have a game or a couple of games that you would
Well,
recommend that might be relevant to people?
I love that squatting game idea, in part because it has all the mechanics of a kind of civilization game already, but it just completely changes the context, right? Defending, building, maintaining. That'd be great. Um, I mentioned earlier, Land and Freedom is a semi-cooperative Spanish Civil War board game. It's cool because no one can play the fascists. You choose a left faction. You compete against each other for predominance, but if you don't also cooperate, the fascists win and everyone loses. Um, um, I'd love to see kind of like a kind of Battle of Algiers kind of anti-colonial game. I think that would be fun. Again, maybe the number of people that would buy these would not be as high as some other games, but so it goes. Apart from that, I don't have great game recommendations through a political lens, um, which is unfortunate because I would play them. But most of the games I play are just kind of regularish games that are kind of fun, and I try to kind of project my own politics on it in ways that sometimes maybe don't fit.
Thank you. Oh God, the squatting simulator. Yeah, honestly, to me that's a horror game. You know? It's triggering me. And I say this from somebody I squatted for 8 years in London, and that was the best of times. It was the worst of times. You know, I say sort of when you don't pay in rent, you pay in mental health. There were quite a few mental breakdowns. But yeah, I would like to definitely, that would be interesting to try. I mean, Return to Castle Wolfenstein was one of formative games for me as well. You know, just sort of this kind of again a horror game, but also yeah, you're shooting Nazis, and I just think it's so moody and gorgeous. And again, it's more of a theme, but it's just I think a wonderful game. I think they're doing a remake now. Look, a shameless plug because actually my partner was like lead designer on this game, but Gerda: A Flame in Winter. The reason why I think it is, well, it's a game that is 1944, a few months before the end of the German occupation of Denmark, and it's a border town, a small border town, and it's the politics between the people in the small border town in like the late 1944, just before the end of the war. And what's subtle about it is that it's exactly how I think kind of a town next to a front line would look like. So it will be full with complicated intentions, betrayals, and actually just very human drama. You know, it's not flashy. It's very much like a three houses and their interactions between each other, and kind of the things that transpire, and emotional drama that transpires between the players there. That, yeah, again, it's small but interesting that way. Now, it's not I haven't been it's not my kind of a game. Just I play more of a shootery and also sim build games. But one has to mention just Disco Elysium, just because I have read too many comments under YouTube, just saying, like, by people that are just saying, you know, like, I went into this game like without thinking of anything, like some detective game, like about a drunken detective. And now I've come out communist on the other side. So seems like whatever was done with the writing in that game, or how it was marketed, I think in very kind of neutral ways, or whatever that it was, something about it attracted a certain game player that wouldn't have thought of themselves as political. Sorry, Mark. Yeah, you want?
Yeah, I love that game. And I completely agree. And I see the political potential there, but I wonder, it makes me think of like great novels in history. And often it's not the kind of like political ideologue that writes the great novel, right? It's someone who's adjacent. And I don't know who made Disco Elysium. I don't know their politics, but it doesn't come across as a straightforwardly political game. It comes across as a weird game that has politics in it. And I wonder if there's something to be learned there.
And that's a strength there, I think. And then last, but I also just think, I don't know, I don't think an anti-fascist game has been made yet. I don't know. I think we're kind of in sub-anti-fascist game territory a little bit, because to me, the anti-fascist game that will be made will be the game that I know that it hasn't killed any people by the making of it. And right now, I don't have that trust. I do think that all games that we're making are creating harm somewhere else in the world, and that to me, you know, still is just not fascism, still not anti-fascism. So yeah, I think sadly, and it sounds a bit kind of dogmatic, I suppose, but like only an anti-capitalist game will make an anti-fascist game, you know. But of course, we live in a society, and I'm very much aware of that. And but I guess it's always good to be striving for something. So that would be the North Star, anyways. Would be some clean up our act altogether as an industry, and create that the North Star of the anti-fascist game one day. Thank you.
I think that potentially we should wrap up slightly soon. There is one other question in the chat, which is talking about a game called Terra Nil. I don't know if anybody has heard of this. It's a cleanup game set in the future with emphasis on new tech. And the person who asked the question asks if you have any thoughts on similar wholesome games that promote like this. And I wonder, maybe it's an opportunity to speak a bit about this, like this wholesome games genre, and whether or not it's doing anything that is politically interesting. Actually, I think there are examples within that kind of terrain that maybe are doing politically interesting things, and there are also maybe examples of like the same kind of cozy game being produced over and over and over again.
I feel very baited, you know. I don't know. I have a couple of strong paragraphs in my book about the wholesome. Again, okay, really depends. It's a spectrum, right? on one hand of the spectrum, I don't think all games should be like militant and gross, and actually it's very nice to just relax in a wholesome game. Also, what does a wholesome game even mean? For me, Quake is a wholesome game, because I feel wholesome in it. So again, really depends. So I'm not fully, of course, like against them. This is fine. But on the other hand, there is a lot of conservativeness and kind of potential to also be proto-fascism, to be in that kind of cute, the aesthetic of the cute. And I think we should always kind of be thinking twice. What is the final kind of suggestion here? And I think wholesome games a lot of the time are actually kitsch adjacent, and that's more of like a art critic's perspective or something. But something to be said about like how kitsch is just, it never challenges anything necessarily. It's there for to sort of be always be perceived as kind of beautiful, but a bit mainstream. And I think there is a certain quality that kind of fits the history as well of also games within that. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's like a whole proud tradition, right? But it just has a certain, I think, a certain history. That's all. Right? I have thoughts.
Yeah, and just to build on that a little, I'm sure you'd agree, Marijam, that we can make whatever forms of art or games we want. It doesn't necessarily mean the fascists won't try to appropriate it and repurpose it. And so that's why, of course, the broader political struggle is pertinent to all this, et cetera, et cetera.
I actually missed two other questions in the chat, and I think there's one that is interesting and maybe speaks a little bit to what I mentioned earlier, which is games for anti-fascists, actually, which asks, could you imagine games as tools for teaching anti-fascist organizing or any other form of left-wing political organizing, like unionizing, for example?
Sure. I mean, the challenge, though, as Max pointed out, is like how accurate and realistic should it be, right? Like organizing a union is painstaking, difficult work that often fails. That doesn't mean that you can't make a game out of it. It just means that there probably has to be some sort of sweet spot between the life-sucking accuracy, but also, building in mechanics around interacting and building power and so forth. And so I think you can teach any kind of politics through games. But that's where the person designing the game needs to be a game person to make it fun, not necessarily someone whose sole point of reference is the politics.
We have also a question about distribution, which says, how have you dealt with distributing your anti-fascist games? How have you made it sustainable? But maybe it's a more general question. How could somebody deal with distributing anti-fascist games and make it sustainable? They say, I'm an indie game dev and only ever hear the business side. Would love to see how people have been able to build new systems of sharing games like this.
Isn't it unbelievable, right? That there's essentially a monopoly of where we buy this entire massive thing, right? Can you imagine a world in which there would be only one store where you can buy all of your shampoos, or only one store where you can buy all of your coffee, or only one store for all the world's bicycles, or something like that? And for some reason, for video games, we allowed that, right? Like we have a monopoly of Steam. That's pretty much it, right? Like, I mean, okay, there are things on the margins, but like that is so ridiculous, and that is so fascist as well, that we have to be at all times at the behest of bloody Steam. And so again, I think the way that the way that Steam also polices the kind of games that you are allowed to have in them is unbelievable. I don't think you'll be able to have like a really kind of how anti-fascism on a dirty day actually looks like on Steam. You won't be able to post that game. So again, that needs to be broken apart. I do sometimes think, again, I compare things to street art just a little bit in regards to, again, that kind of immediacy of like, you haven't thought about it, maybe you don't even, but you encounter something right on the street. And I wonder if there's the very kitsch normie way, of course, would be there's like a QR code, and it takes you to a website where maybe there is the game that you can just download it from. But that's like a very kind of vulgar way of doing it, right? But I wonder, I mean, I think there will be a rise actually of downloading games from people's own websites, not necessarily just on Steam. But perhaps then how do you make sure that you kind of prepare the website and also collect, market it very well and so on. So again, the question is, a lot of the time, it's not about like, again, the game, but it's also how you market it and how to get it in people's hands that you want the audience to be and so on.
So I think we have gone quite a bit over the tight hour that we intended to be here. So I just want to flag that a lot of the games that have been mentioned have now been posted in the chat. including the game in development that I mentioned, Creatures Like Us. And I wanted to ask you one final thing, maybe for the people in the audience who are potentially participating in the game jam, which is just if any of you have a dream game that you would like the people participating in our game jam to make. Perhaps somebody has not yet started the development of their game and is looking for this golden tip.
Great.
Well,
So
I
like,
mean, oh,
yeah, please, Mark. No,
you first.
no. I actually wanted to confirm the question. Is it like one big tip for the aspiring game designer? Sorry.
I think for anybody who's participating in our game jam currently, if you have one piece of advice or a dream game idea or something that you want to leave them with, now would be the time.
I think actually, Briar, when I met you, we discussed this game I played, a video game, computer game from 20 years ago that was sort of a Soviet Marxist revolution game with neighborhoods in a city. And you have to like promote your party against others. But I think there could be an anti-fascist sort of no platforming slash simultaneously building an anti-fascist coalition version of essentially territorial conquest in a city with each neighborhood having different demographics and requiring different kinds of modes of going about it. That would be something I would play.
That's awesome. Yeah, I guess for me, yeah, just the sort of the little one-liners that I kind of rely on when I think about these things is, yeah, create games as tools, not as signifiers. Think of how to make how to make games politically instead of just political games. Yeah, ask who your kind of audience is. And I think involving community and taking community very seriously, I think would be very important. And that might take away from like the authorial ambition potentially, and then that's hard to sort of give away, right? Because as artists, we of course want to create a very complicated piece of art. But sometimes, again, the art is what happens between the players. And actually, what a privilege it is to work in an industry where we have that, where we can create something extremely abstract, and that the players actually do their own thing. I think other art communities don't have that privilege, and so and it can be used for the good. And we've seen, sadly, it just being increasingly utilized by the bad, and often to tragic results. And I really thankful and encouraged for people to just link up with other creators, often from other even other creative industries, and definitely to other political movements and so on. Not necessarily just to stay in games, because we have to be quite universal and very nimble with how we approach this entire massive fucked up fight that continues.
So I think this is a nice place to end. Somebody has flagged in the Q&A that the links that we posted can't be seen by everyone, so maybe we can make sure that we put them in the caption of the video that will be posted afterwards, so that people can see them afterwards. Max, do you have anything to say to conclude? Maybe about the game jam or anything else?
Sure, yeah. Just a reminder that if you are a game maker or you would like to release the game maker inside of you, which I strongly encourage every single human to do, you are welcome to head over to the itch.io page of Games Transformed. That's itch.io. And you can search for Games Transformed, and you can join our Smash the Fash game jam and upload your game. If you also wish to, if you search for Games Transformed, you'll find our link tree, and there you can join our Discord server, where you might be able to find other game designers and people interested in games. Keep an eye out this autumn for our festival. We're just finalizing dates and locations, but it's fairly safe to say it will be in the fourth quarter of the year, and almost certainly, I would say more than almost certainly, it will be in London. And it's really worth coming to. I think it's a really unique gathering, really in the world of radicals thinking through games, the full stack of games. So please join us for that. Um, yeah, and drop us a line if you're interested in collaborating. Yeah, we'd love to do that as well. And I
Thank you
guess
so
it's just,
much. And thank you.
yeah,
This was an amazing opportunity for me to meet Mark as well, who's been like a hero of mine for quite a few decades. So yeah, like this is amazing. And Max and Briar, huge thanks for all your work. We need more amazing people like you. So yeah, thanks everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Pleasure to chat.
thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you both so much. Bye bye.